When a routine traffic stop morphs into a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never imagined. His target is the man who holds his future in his hands. The sun was beginning to set over the streets of Sacramento, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber. Eric Porter was on his way home after a long day at work. His sedan hummed softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to alleviate the day's stress. The radio played quietly, a mellow tune contrasting with the city's bustling streets. Approaching a yellow traffic light, he slowed down, but not enough to avoid it turning red. That's when the flashing blue and red lights erupted behind him, accompanied by the shrill sound of a siren. Eric glanced in his rearview mirror, furrowing his brow. He pulled over and lowered his window as the police car parked behind him. A police officer around 30 years old, with a military haircut and a gleaming badge on his chest, emerged from the car. He confidently adjusted his belt before approaching Eric's vehicle. "License and registration," the officer commanded, his tone authoritative. Eric didn't respond immediately. He made a calm gesture towards the glove compartment, retrieving the documents and handing his driver's license to the officer. His movements were calm and deliberate, but he could feel the officer's gaze on him, as if searching for a reason to delve deeper into the investigation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, leaning closer to the window. "I'm not sure," Eric replied, his voice firm yet polite. "You didn't fully stop at the signal," the officer said, but with a slight hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned but nodded slightly. "I understand. I thought I'd slowed down in time, but I understand." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he remained observing Eric, his eyes narrowing as if deciding this was no longer a simple infraction. His posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if he'd already decided the situation was more serious than it appeared. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, looking at Eric's driver's license. Eric hesitated for a moment. "I moved here a few months ago. The address is on my license," he replied calmly. The officer wasn't paying attention anymore. His voice started to take on a sharper tone. This was no longer a simple traffic violation. Eric sensed the tension rising, but he didn't falter. He felt the officer beginning to see something more in his demeanor, something that unsettled him. Without realizing it, the officer was acting more as if the interrogation were personal, not professional. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" the officer asked, his tone more challenging now. "I'm going home," Eric replied, his tone unchanged, but the air around them felt thicker with tension. The officer didn't seem satisfied with the answer and made a move towards the car door. He crossed his arms. "Get out of the car," he ordered. Eric's hand tightened briefly on the steering wheel, but his face remained expressionless. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, the calmness in his voice reflecting self-control. The officer gave a quick smile, but didn't respond immediately. "Get out of the car now. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." The threat was clear, though not explicitly stated. Eric took a deep breath and opened the door. As he stepped out of the car, the officer sized him up. Eric was slightly taller than the officer, with broad shoulders, but his posture was relaxed, showing no signs of aggression. His attire, a well-tailored suit, suggested someone careful and professional, but the officer didn't seem to care. "Put your hands where I can see them," the officer ordered, his tone now colder. Eric complied, raising his hands deliberately and calmly. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" "Routine," the officer replied with a smile, but no warmth. "We've had a few incidents around here. One can never be too careful." Eric raised an eyebrow, observing the exchange. "Incidents involving men in suits and sedans, or is this something else entirely?" The question was direct and hit its mark. The officer faltered for a moment, his expression hardening. He took a step back, touching his belt, more out of reflex than necessity. "Watch your tone," he warned, his voice now rougher. Eric remained firm. "I merely asked a question." The officer, visibly unsettled, moved closer. "You seem to know exactly how this works. Are you trying to hide something?" Eric remained silent for a moment, letting the question hang in the air. "No, officer. I simply believe in being clear about the reasons for interactions such as this. Transparency, you understand?" The officer snorted, but didn't reply. He paced back and forth, clearly uncomfortable with Eric's calm demeanor, which wasn't reacting as he expected. There was no fear, no nervousness, just an unsettling calmness. "You seem rather confident," the officer said quietly, almost to himself, "as if you know what's going to happen next." Eric didn't rise to the bait. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." The officer stopped, freezing for a brief second before resuming his stance. "Respect, eh?" he said with a challenging tone. "You think this is about respect?" Eric didn't move. "Yes, and you seem not to understand that." The tension between the two became palpable. The officer, irritated, approached again, his tone deepening. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric replied without hesitation, looking the officer in the eye. "No, officer. I simply believe interaction should be fair." The officer was clearly agitated now, but he couldn't back down. "People like you always think they know better." Eric's words hung in the air, striking a nerve with the officer. "People like me?" he asked with a hint of surprise. The officer tried to defend himself, but he had already crossed an invisible line. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Now turn around and put your hands on the bonnet of the car." Eric silently complied. As the officer moved in to pat him down, the touches were cursory, but the pressure in his stance made it clear he was trying to reassert control. But Eric didn't react, not with a tremor or a flinch, just calmness. "Clean," the officer muttered, visibly frustrated as he stepped back. "Of course," Eric said calmly, without losing his composure. "Now, if you're finished, I'd like to leave." The officer interrupted impatiently. "I'm not finished. You know very well what you can and can't do. Care to explain?" Eric remained impassive, his posture relaxed, but his words cut like a blade. "I've had my fair share of interactions with the law, officer. Let's just say I've learned a great deal over the years." The officer narrowed his eyes. "So, you're a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled with a hint of irony. "Or something." The vague answer irritated the officer further. He moved closer still, almost invading Eric's personal space. "Listen here. You think you're smarter than me?" Think you're going to talk your way out of this? Eric met his gaze without flinching. I don't think anything, officer. I simply believe in justice. And so far, I'm not seeing much justice here. The officer opened his mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come. Those last words of Eric's seemed to have resonated deeper than he anticipated. Eric continued, his voice now firmer. The issue here isn't profiling, it isn't unwarranted escalation. The issue is that you did all of this without even knowing who you were dealing with. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights. You assumed I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. The officer attempted a defense, but Eric cut him off, his voice calm and firm. The worst part of all this is that you didn't realize that until now, everything you've done has been based on the idea that I'm not worthy of respect. And that, officer, isn't just my problem. It's a problem for everyone who crosses your path. The officer, visibly shaken, looked at Eric's badge, trying to understand the situation. Eric didn't falter. You will step back, return my documents, and think carefully about what you're going to say next. The officer hesitated, but handed over the documents without another word. Eric took them, placed them in his wallet, and walked towards his car. Before getting in, he looked at the officer one last time. Remember this, officer. Your badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you responsible for everyone. As he got into the car and started the engine, Eric felt the tension in the air ease. The officer remained standing, unsure how to handle the situation. For Eric, however, it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The next step, he knew, would have repercussions throughout the entire department. The following morning, Eric was in his office, reviewing Bradley Larson's record. The file lay open before him, a list of accumulating complaints, none of which had been resolved. Eric knew Larson wasn't an exception, but a reflection of a deeper problem. This couldn't continue. When Eric's secretary entered the room, he was ready to act. What he had in mind wasn't just Larson's suspension. He planned a complete overhaul of how the police force behaved, of how they dealt with the people they were sworn to protect. Eric knew that if he didn't start at the top, nothing would change. When Linda, his assistant, entered the room with stacks of reports, Eric was already focused on what needed to be done. He took the files without hesitation and quickly reviewed them. The meeting with the chief of police, General Daniels, was scheduled for later. Before delving into the matter, he paused briefly to reflect on what would come next. He knew what he was about to begin wouldn't be easy. Larson's suspension wouldn't solve the systemic problem. Eric had seen this before, more than once. The system protected itself, reacting quickly to contain temporary damage, but there was no real change. True change didn't come from isolated actions, but from a profound reformulation of how the police interacted with people, and more importantly, how it viewed itself. It wasn't just a matter of correcting errors here and there, but of creating a new type of culture within the force. However, before taking any more drastic measures, Eric needed the help of those at the top. He knew that General Daniels, although a respected veteran, didn't share the same revolutionary vision he did. For him, the policy of keeping things internal and not making waves was an immutable principle. But Eric was determined to change that. even if it meant facing resistance. The meeting with the chief took place in the afternoon. When Eric entered General Daniels' office, he didn't meet the welcoming gaze he usually saw at other times. The man, his hair peppered with grey, was visibly tense, sitting with his hands clasped on the desk. Daniel's expression said he knew exactly what was coming. "You have a minute to talk, Eric?" the general asked before Eric sat down. "I have as much time as you need, Chief," Eric replied with a confident yet non-arrogant tone. "I'm here because we can't let Police Officer Larson's situation be an isolated incident. This behavior didn't just appear overnight. It reflects a deeper problem, something that's been festering for a long time. You know that." Daniel sighed heavily, as if he'd anticipated this conversation. "You know how things work here, Eric. Everything has to be resolved internally, away from the spotlight. The community doesn't need to know everything. We can't create a crisis where there isn't one." Eric didn't move. His eyes locked with the chief's, a challenging yet serene gaze. "That's what you think, but problems only worsen when we try to sweep failings under the carpet. They grow silently and then return to strike us harder. We need a complete overhaul. Not just of one officer's actions, but of our culture, our protocols, the way we train officers." Silence filled the room for a moment, and Eric knew he was pushing the chief of police. But he couldn't back down now. This was the only opportunity to put genuine change into motion. We failed the community, the people we swore to protect, and we primarily failed the people who wear the uniform, who are being taught to view the public as enemies, as threats. That's not how we should be operating. We can no longer be complacent. Daniel seemed to weigh Eric's words, but deep down he knew the truth was there, right in front of him. "And what do you expect me to do? You know how much this will cost us all, right? And how the media will react. I've seen this happen before. The consequences aren't simple." "I understand the risks, Chief," Eric said, but his voice didn't waver. "But the question is, how long will we continue to postpone what needs to be done? How long will we see situations like Larson's and pretend everything's all right? The truth is, if we don't act now, community trust in the police will never be restored. And your authority, General, will be increasingly questioned." General Daniels' gaze was strained, as if holding back internal pressure. He wanted to give in, but something inside him prevented him from taking the step. "So what do you want, Eric? Are you asking me to end the policy of smoothing things over? To expose all this to the world?" Eric didn't hesitate. "Exactly. We're not here to hide mistakes. We need a public review of our system, our failings, and what we're doing to improve. We need to be transparent. I can no longer turn a blind eye to this. I can no longer be complicit." Daniels looked at the ceiling and then at the papers on his desk, his fingers tapping lightly on the material. It was clear he was conflicted, battling between his loyalty to the system and Eric's external pressures. "You know how the department reacts to these proposals, Eric. They won't take a public review well." "I know," Eric replied, an unwavering calm in his voice. "But that's what we need. Radical change, starting now." Silence hung between them as the general seemed to ponder. But soon he leaned forward, finally speaking. "And if this doesn't work? What if you end up throwing everything away? Are you sure you're prepared for the consequences? Eric met Daniel's eyes, now with absolute clarity. The greater consequence is the failure to try. I won't allow this institution, which should be an example to the community, to continue to turn a blind eye to what's wrong. I won't be the guy who could have done something and remained silent. I can't. Daniels took a deep breath, and for a moment the weight of the decision fell upon him. Finally he nodded, but with a cautious expression. You have my support, Eric, but be prepared for what's to come. This will stir things up more than you realize. Eric stood, feeling the weight of the words he'd just heard. Change is coming, General, and I won't stop until I see it happen. Leaving the room, Eric felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. He was in the eye of a storm, but he was also ready to lead the change the police force so desperately needed. In the following weeks, Eric worked tirelessly to organize a series of meetings and public hearings. The feedback he received from the community was largely critical, but there was a spirit of hope in the air, as if people were finally beginning to believe they could be part of real change. Meanwhile, Larson's case dragged through the system. The officer was placed on temporary suspension, but this felt like a makeshift solution. The problem wasn't just Larson. The problem was the system that allowed him to act with impunity. Tension within the police department intensified, but Eric was prepared to deal with whatever came his way. He knew that truth and justice would always prevail, eventually. With each step he took, he felt the weight of what was at stake, but at the same time knew he was in the right position to make a difference. The fight was far from over, but Eric was certain that change was finally on the horizon. He looked to the future, aware that the battle for reform was only just beginning. But unlike many, he already knew that the real fight wasn't just against others. It was against complacency, and he wouldn't surrender to it. His next steps would be decisive, and he was ready to face the consequences. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Eric had no time to relax. Meetings, reports, public hearings, and conversations with community members consumed every minute of his day. The pressure mounted, and he knew he was dealing with a system that, for too long, had chosen to ignore its flaws rather than confront them. He also knew the resistance would be fierce. Changing an institution as entrenched as the police force wouldn't be a simple task, but Eric was determined. For him, this wasn't just a matter of doing things the right way. It was a matter of responsibility, of justice. In Eric's office, meetings on the progress of the reform followed each other at an impressive rate. Linda, his assistant, brought in more reports, each more unsettling than the last. Reports of abuse of power, of prejudiced attitudes among officers, and of veiled attitudes that suggested Larson's behavior was not an isolated incident. Each report seemed to strengthen Eric's resolve. He knew he had to go deeper. He couldn't settle for superficial change. The system had to be deconstructed and rebuilt from the ground up, and that required courage. The courage to confront those clinging to the status quo, to challenge the hierarchy, and most importantly, to hold officers accountable for their actions. While Eric dedicated himself to the hard work, Larsson's case continued its course. The officer was suspended, and while this was an important step, Eric knew it was only a temporary fix. The suspension wouldn't solve the underlying problem, and what he needed was to ensure there were no more Larssons anywhere in the police force. To that end, he was preparing a complete overhaul of police practices, a process that would examine everything from training to the officers' day-to-day practices. That afternoon, while Eric was analyzing the data collected on the various incidents, he received an unexpected phone call. It was General Daniels, the Chief of Police. His voice was serious, and though he tried to disguise it, Eric knew something was up. "Eric, we need to talk. It's about the review you're proposing. I know you mean well, but the pressure from above is immense. This could cause us problems. I need you to understand the gravity of the situation." The general's voice was strained, almost pleading. Eric didn't hesitate. "I know exactly what's at stake, General, but if we don't do this now, things will only get worse. We can't keep trying to put out fires here and there. We need real change, a transformation starting from the top down. If it causes problems, so be it, because what we're doing now isn't working. You know that as well as I do." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Eric could hear the general's breathing, as if he were weighing what to say next. "I know you're right, Eric, but what you're proposing is too big. The repercussions could be devastating. And we're not just talking about an internal overhaul, we're talking about a change that will resonate throughout the city, throughout the nation. The spotlight will be on us, and you know how relentless the media can be." Eric felt a wave of frustration, but he remained calm. "General, we need to do this. We can't keep ignoring the mistakes, trying to cover up failings with secrecy. What we're doing now is just masking the problems. If we don't take action now, our credibility, our authority will be destroyed, and the public will no longer trust the police. We can't let that happen." The conversation with General Daniels was tense, but in the end, he agreed to support Eric's plan. It wasn't a total victory, but it was a significant step. Eric knew the real battle was only just beginning, and he wasn't going to give up. His resolve was stronger than ever. The next step was presenting the proposed review to the department's oversight committee. Eric knew that, even with Daniel's support, the road wouldn't be easy. The committee members were used to a system where things were done quietly, where problems were solved within the four walls of the department, without the critical eye of the media or the community. They were aware of the failings, but many refused to admit that significant changes were needed. At the meeting, Eric stood, his expression serious, his posture commanding. He looked at the committee members, and before anyone could speak, began his presentation. "Good afternoon. As you all know, the Bradley Larsson case is just the tip of the iceberg. It's not an isolated incident. We have records of prejudicial and abusive behavior amongst our own officers. We're dealing with a culture of complacency and abuse of power that can no longer be ignored. And more importantly, we can no longer turn a blind eye." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He knew the impact of his words was significant. But it wasn't time to back down. Our department needs a complete overhaul from the top down. We need to reassess our protocols, our training, and how we interact with the community. We can no longer hide our mistakes. We need to be transparent, accountable for our actions, and ensure we're doing the job we were appointed to do. And the public needs to see that. We need to rebuild trust. The room was silent. The committee members exchanged nervous glances, some visibly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. Eric could feel the weight of the words he'd just delivered, and he knew that, having uttered them, there was no turning back. He was challenging the system, challenging those who, until that moment, had conformed to the status quo. After a few minutes of silence, the oldest committee member stood. His expression was skeptical, but there was a certain resignation in his posture. "Eric, what you're proposing is radical. This will shake the entire department structure. It will put us all at risk. Are you sure you're prepared for this? The resistance will be immense." Eric didn't falter. "I understand the magnitude of this. But the real question is, can we continue ignoring the problems until they destroy us? Can we continue pretending everything is all right when we know it isn't? If we want to be a trustworthy institution, an institution that serves the community with integrity, we have to change. And change isn't easy, but it's necessary." The meeting continued for hours, with heated debates, objections, and counter-arguments. But in the end, Eric's proposal was accepted. Not unanimously, but a majority of the committee members agreed that significant changes were needed. It was a partial victory, but a victory nonetheless. Eric knew the fight was far from over. He would have to face much more resistance before the changes were realized, but at that moment he felt a sense of relief. He had taken the first step towards transforming the department, restoring community trust, and ensuring that something like this would never happen again. The road ahead would be long, but Eric was prepared. He knew the battle for justice and accountability wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to fight for it to the end. And with each step he took, he knew he was closer to creating a police force that was finally worthy of its mission, to protect and serve everyone with respect and dignity. For Eric, this was only the beginning. He had much more to do, and with his determination and courage, he was ready to face any challenge that came his way. The following weeks were a test of patience and resilience for Eric. The review plan he had proposed was being implemented gradually, but the forces opposed to real change were unwilling to yield easily. Even with the committee's approval, the changes were far from being willingly accepted by all members of the department. There was a silent but firm resistance from those who preferred the quietude of the status quo. Eric knew that to achieve his objectives, he would need to confront more than just the resistance of some department members. The biggest challenge lay in how to deal with those who still believed nothing needed to change. Decades of complacency wouldn't disappear overnight, and it wouldn't be easy to convince all officers that the changes were, in fact, for the good of the force and the community. The first major step after the plan's approval was the implementation of a series of mandatory workshops and training sessions. Eric knew that this training needed to be more than mere formalities. It needed to be profound, impactful, and above all, necessary to break the old patterns of behavior. The training wouldn't just be about the law, but about building empathy, respect, and above all, understanding the role of police officers within a democratic society. Eric took on the responsibility of leading these training sessions. He knew his presence in the process was crucial to demonstrating a genuine commitment to change. When he entered the room for the first workshop, he felt the weight of the situation. There was a mixture of skepticism and discomfort in the air. Many of the officers were there out of obligation, not desire. The room was full of men and women who, until that moment, had been trained to see the police as an entity separate from and superior to the community they swore to protect. With a firm but not arrogant tone, Eric began to speak. Our job isn't just to enforce the law. Our job is to protect and serve the community. And to do that effectively, we need to understand the people we're here to help. We need to understand their fears, their frustrations, and above all, respect their rights. Some officers looked at him with suspicion, while others seemed disinterested. But Eric remained undeterred. He continued with the conviction he knew was the only way to break down the wall of resistance he faced. We can't continue with a them and us mentality. We are a vital part of society. When someone puts on this uniform, they commit to acting with dignity, with respect, and with a true understanding of the power they hold. We cannot allow that power to be used to intimidate, to oppress, or to humiliate. We need to be an example of justice, not blind force. The tension in the room was palpable. Eric knew he was touching a raw nerve. Many of the officers weren't prepared for this approach. They were used to dealing with others from a position of superiority. For some, the idea of being vulnerable and empathetic seemed a threat to their authority. But Eric wasn't there to please. He was there to make a difference, and that meant upsetting people, challenging them to question their beliefs, and eventually to change. He spent the next few days interspersing presentations on ethics and civil rights with practical simulations, where officers were challenged to handle complex situations in a more compassionate and respectful manner. The idea was simple. If they could put themselves in someone else's shoes, they would be more effective in carrying out their duty. However, progress was slow. While there were officers who began to absorb Eric's messages, many still saw the changes as a threat. The deeply ingrained hierarchical structure of the police force wasn't something easily shaken. And, worse still, some of the most powerful within the department were clearly unhappy with the direction Eric was trying to impose. They were prepared to fight to preserve the system as it was, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the mistakes made by officers. A month later, a crucial meeting was scheduled to discuss the results of the first training cycle. Eric knew this would be an opportunity to assess progress, but also to confront his opponents. When he entered the conference room, he was met with disinterested stares and closed expressions. The atmosphere was tense. The committee members were eager to discuss the numbers, the data, and the reports that had been collected up to that point. "Good morning, everyone," Eric began, his voice firm and clear. "We are here today to assess the impact of the first training cycle. As you all know, our mission is to ensure that the department becomes a fairer, more transparent, and above all, more connected institution within the community. We are not here to simply discuss numbers, but to discuss the changes that are already happening and how we can improve even further. General Daniels was seated at the table with a serious expression. Eric knew that, although the general had supported him up to that point, he was also under pressure from others within the department. He knew that the change was challenging the power balance and the way things had always been done. "Eric, the numbers show some improvements," Daniel said in a measured tone. "But there's also an increase in complaints from officers who feel uncomfortable with this new type of approach. Some of them are saying that the change is affecting their authority and effectiveness on the streets. This is something we need to consider." Eric remained calm. "I understand the concerns, General, but a police officer's authority doesn't come from intimidation or fear. True authority comes from respect, and the effectiveness of our profession isn't measured by the force with which we wield our power, but by how we ensure the safety and well-being of the community, fairly and equitably." "But what do you want us to do, Eric?" asked one of the more conservative committee members with an impatient tone. "Are we simply to turn our backs on everything we've learned? Abandon our authority? That'll put us all at risk. And what about high-risk situations? How do you deal with a dangerous criminal if you don't show force?" Eric took a deep breath. He knew this was one of the biggest objections he would face, the resistance to the idea of more humane and less aggressive policing. "I'm not saying we should be weak or complacent. I'm saying we should be smarter, to use our force strategically and controlled, to de-escalate situations before they become dangerous, to have more effective communication, without resorting to tactics that compromise everyone's safety." The room fell silent as the committee members reflected on Eric's words. He knew he wasn't just combating a culture, but trying to transform a deeply ingrained mindset. The resistance would be considerable, but he also knew that the seeds of change were being sown. It wouldn't be an easy path, but with every step he took, he felt he was closer to creating a system that was truly worthy of the community's trust. In the following days, the number of officers expressing frustration with Eric's approach increased. But surprisingly, there were also some who began to recognize the benefits of more careful and empathetic policing. Eric focused on these officers, offering support and encouragement, knowing that the transformation, though difficult, was beginning to bear fruit. Although the road was long and fraught with obstacles, Eric felt that each challenge brought him closer to his ultimate goal, to create a police force that was synonymous with justice, dignity, and respect. He knew the real impact of this change would be felt in the coming years, but the fight was far from over. He was prepared to continue facing any resistance that arose, because he knew he was doing what was right, not just for the department, but for the entire community. Despite all the difficulties, Eric's work was beginning to show signs of progress. There was resistance, of course, but there were also those willing to listen, to reflect on their actions and to change. The weeks that followed were crucial. Eric knew that real, sustainable change wouldn't come simply from imposing new rules, but from an internal transformation of each police officer. He needed to ensure that the system as a whole evolved, that the force understood the value of empathy, justice, and transparency. The meetings, training sessions, and discussions continued, but something was changing in the department's atmosphere. Eric observed how certain officers were beginning to interact differently with citizens, how the most skeptical were beginning to question their own attitudes. The change was indeed slow, but it was happening. He could feel it. One afternoon, while reviewing new reports on interactions between police officers and civilians, Eric was interrupted by a knock on his office door. Linda entered with a slightly tense expression, but a smile on her face. "You need to see this, Eric. It's something that will interest you," she said, handing him a tablet. On the screen was a recording of a police officer from the department dealing with an incident in a deprived neighborhood of the city. What most caught Eric's attention was the way the officer was conducting the approach, calmly, without shouting, without threatening. He was speaking with the individual, trying to understand the situation before taking any action. Respect and consideration for the other person were evident. "This is one of the direct results of our training," Eric murmured to himself. He knew it wasn't perfect, and that there was still much work to be done, but this was concrete proof that the transformation was underway. The following weeks were marked by greater integration between the police department and the community. Eric encouraged more meetings between officers and civilians, fostering dialogues that had previously seemed impossible. He knew that true trust would be built over time, but he was already seeing signs that the relationship between the police and the population was changing. When people saw police officers on the streets now, they didn't look with fear, but with a growing sense of respect. And for Eric, this was a huge step, but the difficulties hadn't ended. The media, always ready to exploit any flaw or mistake, began to question whether the process of change was happening quickly enough. Eric knew it wouldn't be easy to maintain the support of the community and the media while the department underwent this transformation. He was dealing with a legacy of mistrust that wouldn't be erased in the blink of an eye. The turning point came during a tense meeting with a group of journalists who were there to ask about the changes being implemented. Some questioned whether the process wasn't too slow. Others wanted to know why, in some cases, policing still seemed excessive. The pressure was immense, and Eric felt the weight of the questions, but he didn't flinch. He knew he couldn't fall into empty promises, but he also knew he couldn't let criticism derail him. "I know many people still have doubts about whether we're doing enough, and I understand those concerns," Eric began, looking directly into the camera. "But the truth is that such profound change doesn't happen overnight. What we're doing here isn't just reform. It's a revolution in how the police relate to the community. We're working tirelessly to ensure that our officers not only uphold the law, but uphold it with respect, with transparency, with empathy. This takes time." He paused, taking a deep breath. The pressure was immense, but he knew he needed to be honest. Transformation isn't something that can be forced. Every police officer, every official working here needs to internalize this change. and I can't promise that everyone will adapt immediately. What I can promise is that while I'm here, I won't give up on continuing to do what's right. True change takes time, and we're only just beginning." Eric's words resonated sincerely, and although there was criticism, many of the journalists present perceived Eric's genuine commitment. From that moment, public perception began to shift, albeit slowly. Resistance wasn't something that could be definitively overcome in a single event, but rather something that would be overcome with consistency and courage over time. However, the greatest proof that the changes were beginning to bear fruit came from within the department itself. During an internal meeting, one of the most senior officers, known for his gruff and authoritarian behavior, stood up to speak. To many, he was one of the biggest challenges to the process of change, someone who had never shown any interest in rethinking his approach. But that day, his demeanor was different. "I'll be honest with you," he said, in a softer voice than usual. "I didn't believe any of this at first. I thought Eric was exaggerating, that we were going too far. But after working with him and participating in these training sessions, I realized something. I realized that we, as police officers, have a much greater responsibility than simply enforcing the law. We have to do so fairly, and that requires more than just authority. It demands respect. It demands empathy." Eric listened to the officer's words with a subtle smile. He knew the resistance was waning, that there was a growing movement towards a more humane and responsible police force. The change he sought was happening, not perfectly, not without difficulties, but it was happening. The reform was still in its early stages, but the foundations were being laid. Eric knew there was still much to be done, but he also knew that the seeds he had planted were beginning to sprout. He was no longer just facing the resistance of an outdated system. He was creating, step by step, a new system. And more importantly, he was ensuring that the Sacramento Police Department would once again be seen as a true pillar of justice, dignity, and respect for all. He knew there would be no clear finish line. Change wasn't a destination, but an ongoing process, and Eric was prepared to continue fighting, to continue pushing, to continue being the voice of justice and integrity within an institution that was, finally, beginning to understand the true meaning of to serve and protect. The road ahead was still long, but now he knew he was heading in the right direction, with the courage and determination needed to transform the Sacramento Police Department once and for all. The real change, he realized, was only just beginning, and he was more than ready to continue leading this journey.